Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. So I know for me it's good morning, but for some of you it might be good afternoon or almost good evening or good night. My name is Ryan Martinez. I'm a first-year student at Metro Styles College. I'm also a student fellow at the South Asian Studies Council. And today we will be speaking with other student fellows and related students in speaking about our experience related to COVID, our transition to online learning, especially through Canvas or Zoom, and also really just focusing on our personal experiences with everything that's going on. So I will ask our student fellows to introduce themselves, starting with Sneha.
Hi everyone, my name is Sneha and I'm a junior. I'm going to become a senior after the summer ends. So I actually major in theater studies as well as business management. And I study in the National University of Singapore, but got the chance to spend a year under the Yale Visiting International Students Program. So in my junior year that I spent at Yale, I was working as a student fellow at the South Asian Council. And yeah, we'll be talking to you about our personal experiences adjusting to that today.
Mehmet?
Hi everyone, my name is Mehmet. I'm a rising junior in Solomon College. I major in statistics and history, and I'm in Istanbul right now. I'm an international student, and I think that's about it.
Thank you. Ram?
So, my name's Ram. I'm a rising senior at from Silliman College as well. I also study history. My hometown's Bangalore, India, but at the moment I'm still in New Haven.
Thank you. Iman?
Hello, I'm a rising sophomore in Morse College. I'm also an international and I'm originally from Lahore, Pakistan, which is where I am right now, and it's 7 p.m. Besides that, I'm a potential major in history and economics, but I'm not entirely sure yet. And yeah, like Sneha mentioned, I'll be talking to you about my experiences with COVID-19 and moving back home.
Hey, thank you very much, you all, for joining us today. And I think the first off, what we're going to do is just really, since when have you been in your current locations? I know most of you are currently home. How is that the living situation? Are you living with family or with friends, or how many people are in the household? If you can just go in the same order right now.
So I'm back in my hometown, Singapore, and I am living with my family here. I've been here since the start of spring break. Actually, I had intended to come back just for the 2-week period of spring break, but halfway through I was notified like don't come back, and so I decided to just stay here. All my belongings are still in my college at Yale, which is Morse College as well, and I'm hoping to get them back soon. I don't know, I'm still waiting for the Yale to settle that side, but at home we have about 5 people staying, including myself. So things have been okay here. It's not too bad. There is a lockdown until June 1st, and after that, things are slowly going to be starting to open up in Singapore.
Yeah, I came back almost 2 months ago, right in the middle of spring break. So my initial plan was to go to Colorado to visit my roommate for a week. And I did that. I went there, but while I was there, they sent out an announcement saying, don't come back to campus if you don't have to. And I had prepared for it. So I had taken like all my passports, all my Turkish identification cards and everything that I would like most severely urgently need to go back home. So I actually didn't need to go back home. But the biggest problem was I only had a carry-on luggage with me. So I only had like 5 t-shirts, 2 jeans, a pair of shoes, etc., etc. So I called my college. They bought me a ticket. And since there are no direct flights from Colorado to Istanbul, I had to have a layover somewhere. And this was a little kind of tough because my first flight got delayed for 2 hours and my layover time was 2 hours in Boston. and I had to like run between terminals. I was almost going to miss my flight, but then I made it to my flight. It was like 1 a.m. in the morning. I didn't have anyone to stay with in Boston had I missed my flight, but thankfully all went well. And about 2 months ago, I came back to Istanbul, and since then I've rarely been leaving the house. Um, and yeah, that's about it. At home, I live with my mom, so it's only me and her, which is a very comfortable situation compared to most people. So I can't really complain about space issues and stuff. And most of the time when I was doing my online classes, I had enough space, I had decent internet connection. Logistics wise, everything was working for me.
So I live on an off-campus apartment in New Haven, and so haven't really moved since then. So when the email first came out, because I was off campus, there was no sort of ticking clock on me having to move, and so I was I was definitely grateful for that. But I'd also think that perhaps I was a little too satisfied to stay in my off-campus apartment, and so I missed the time, the short time period I have to go back home. And of course now there are no international flights going to India, and so it's going to be a while until I can get back home. But I'm definitely well taken care of here. I have 3 of my friends living with me, and their company has been really, really useful.
So I came back around like 8 or 9 days into spring break. So for the first half of spring break, I was supposed to stay on campus, and then I was going to go to Florida with my friends. And for some reason, 7 days in, I was still pretty optimistic about that. But like around the 7th or 8th day, when like the email came in and everything, so I had a flight booked for May to go back to Pakistan. So I only switched it back to spring break, and sort of just took the next flight out, which was sort of the like after a day and a half. So I really packed my suite in a rush and left for the airport, and then came back home. But I'm honestly very, very grateful that I did that, because so they, like, Pakistan pretty much closed down their borders with most countries, so we weren't really getting, like, there weren't really any flight options available for the next few weeks, after which I flew back. And then I also flew back at a good time, because there were only 27 cases in Pakistan at the time. So it wasn't too bad in terms of like testing opportunities, or like even in terms of like having the ability to navigate airports and stuff like that. At home, I live with my family. I have 2 brothers, so we're like 5 people. And it's been pretty chill. I think the only thing that was like a preliminary concern with the classes, I'm not entirely sure if that's within the scope of this question, but since everyone's mentioned that, I think the main thing was that the classes were too far into the night. Like, I was up until 5 a.m. on some days taking classes, and that was a little bit of a hassle. But besides that, it's been fairly nice.
Thank you. And I want to make a specific point, and this really mostly applies to Mehmet, Sneha, and Imad. Really just, how did you notice the conditions and the environment in the airports? I flew out the first day of break, so that was March 6th, and it was meaning like business as usual. Few people wearing masks, but not really many, and you know, everybody was crowded and everything. And I flew out from New York City in LaGuardia Airport, and if you landed in your home country, did they do specific tests, or do you have to fill out specific questionnaires, or was it just a regular flight for you all?
So I took a flight from JFK to Frankfurt, and then Frankfurt to Singapore, because that was a layover at Frankfurt. But just like you, Ryan, I actually came back quite early on in the spring break, so probably about March 8th, 7th, around there. And things still weren't that bad. It was pretty much business as usual. They were asking like a few questions, but there wasn't much paranoia yet. a lot of people were still not wearing masks, and JFK was still quite crowded. I think I got like the lines took about the usual time. Like that's how crowded it was still. Things weren't that bad. Like the flights were all the same, and in Singapore when I returned, things were a bit different than usual because there were a few like medical personnel, like just like there were like booths to take your temperature and check any medical symptoms. But I think it was only some people were called out, and I wasn't one of them. So I didn't have that experience. I didn't have to go through that, thankfully. So it was pretty much a normal flight for me. Yeah.
Yeah, this is an interesting question because I have been in 4 different airports in 5 days, in a span of 5 days. So I was initially at JFK. This is maybe the second day of spring break, and it was business as usual, except for maybe like a couple of people with masks and gloves. Then I went to Denver, nothing at all, no masks, no one is concerned, business as usual. Then I flew out of Denver again. Then I saw, it was like a couple of days after, so I saw a few people with masks. So it seemed like people were getting caught up with the situation. Then I was in Boston for like 15 minutes, so I didn't see anything. But when I was in Istanbul, it was actually much better. The police officers had like masks, mandatory masks, and they told us that we were going through like thermal cameras to see if our temperature was high, and no one got called out in my kind of cohort. But it was reassuring to know that that was a possibility.
So I flew out of New York kind of late. So this is around 13th March or 14th March. But honestly, it was still pretty lax in terms of the fact that only people were wearing, like some people were wearing like masks, and I saw like a greater frequency of people generally like using sanitizers and stuff. But in terms of like actual paranoia, in terms of lesser people boarding flights or lesser people flying out, I don't think that was like a different circumstance that I saw in terms of like the flight that I took. So I had a layover in Dubai, completely normal, like classic Dubai. People were still vacationing because it's like spring break. And then when I got to Pakistan, surprisingly, Pakistan has had like a lot of coronavirus paranoia simply because it's like located in like very close to both China and Iran. So like when I landed here, it was poorly handled, but they were like they had like methods in place. So the first thing they sort of required us to do was fill out questionnaires detailing like where we had traveled in the past 7 days, any symptoms that we'd experienced, what layovers we'd taken, stuff like that. And they did take like they used the thermometer guns for every single passenger in the flight. But one of the weirdest things was that when you sort of get off the flight, they had like a singular waiting room where they were expecting every single person to wait before they were going to check your your temperature. So there's sort of like 400 people that get off this massive flight in a singular room, which is sort of anticlimactic. But they did have a couple of like things in place, and then they did have so I got to Pakistan the week that they started the quarantine as well. So around the 20th to 23rd of March, they sort of announced a lockdown in Pakistan in different cities. So I sort of got here, was meant to do the mandatory 7-day quarantine, and then just automatically transitioned into the permanent lockdown. And that was continued till last week. So it just got lifted last week.
Okay, thank you. And this question is specifically for Ram. You mentioned that India is currently not allowing any flights into the country, and that despite you still being able to live on your off-campus housing, that you at sometimes wish that you could have gone back when it was still open. I know the United States, for its residents and for its citizens, they have been communicating back and forth if they were abroad. Has the government of India done the same thing for Indian nationals, or is it just more of an opt-in system?
Yeah, so the Indian government for a while was allowing citizens to come, but I'm also not a citizen. I have an overseas citizenship of India card, which is sort of like an almost citizen thingy. Anyway, but at the moment, India is also repatriating some of its nationals from different countries. But those are mainly sort of workers who are stuck without money. Generally, some people who are petitioning to return back home, and people who are in urgent distress. I don't really count myself amongst that at all. And so there is a chance that, you know, in future months they will open some flights and I can ask to go back. Um, but definitely I'm not in the category of people who are going back right now.
I see. And I know some of you mentioned started mentioning your experience with online education. So really, if you can go into further detail about that, dealing with Zoom, with Canvas, or really just doing electronic communication through email. Speak of any specific challenges. Some of you said that, you know, some of your circumstances were well. But also talk about how do you think online learning affected the course content that you were being delivered by your professors? If the professors did significant changes to the syllabus, or do you believe that you still were able to receive the general ideas of the course?
Sorry. Yeah, so the question was about how we adapted to the change back home to online learning. Is that right?
Yes.
So I think the biggest challenge for me was definitely time difference. I think a lot of my classes as well, I didn't know how it was gonna be converted to an online course because I'm a theater major, and there was a class I was taking which was stage combat. So I didn't know, and that was like 100% practical class, and I didn't know how that was gonna have any theoretical component, or how like everything was, like all our final assignments were like basically performances, and I didn't know how that, like what that meant, until kind of the first day of the class that we had, where we talked about the structure of the class and how that was gonna affect it. I think a lot of it panned out in a way that our performance was still very much creative in nature. It was just kind of converted to a film medium. So we had to film ourselves doing our performance, and everything became a solo performance, obviously, because we weren't able to contact our partners and we weren't able to work with them or collaborate with anyone. So that was like one of the big things. The second biggest thing was obviously time difference. So in Singapore, it is 12 hours ahead of Eastern time. So all my classes were effectively went from AM to PM and PM to AM, which wasn't too bad at the start because I was still kind of jet lagged. And for some reason, even though I'd come back at the start of spring break, my sleep cycle never really fell into place. It was still really wonky because I was still running on US time, and that had no implications because it was break. So classes, adjusting to classes in the first week was okay, and then second week was actually ironically harder because I had kind of like reset my sleep cycle to Singapore time, and that meant that I had classes from 1:30 to 3:30. That was the probably the worst timing. I didn't have to go beyond that, which was honestly not too bad. And a lot of my professors were really understanding. They the minute they heard that I was in this time zone, a lot of them made concessions to allow me to watch recordings of the seminar, and instead of participating live, I would send in a reading response before the class began, for example. So these were the ways in which the faculty members were really, really helpful and understanding in accommodating that change for international students, which I felt really touched by, obviously. Assignments also became a lot more flexible. It became a lot more conditional. So depending on everyone's circumstances, it would vary, you know, and I think there was a lot of understanding and compassion on the side of the professors that, for example, if we had to film our final presentation, not everyone has a backyard or not everyone has access to that much space. So a lot of these things were circumstantial, and that was really nice. Yeah, honestly, I think that the shift was smoother than I expected. I honestly expected to be staying up all night, and my parents were prepared for it. They were all geared up. My mom had this whole schedule um, saying, like, okay, if you sleep at this time, you should wake up at this time to make sure you have enough sleep. And I was mentally prepared for that. But it turns out that even the number of classes were significantly reduced, so I didn't have to worry about the consistently irregular sleep cycle and all of that.
Yeah, so the time difference wasn't as big of a problem for me as it was for Sneha and Iman. Um, we are +7 in comparison to the Eastern Standard Time, which means that my latest class, which ends at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, would end at 10 p.m. my time, which was doable. So I didn't have to stay up late or anything like that. In terms of academics, so I was taking 2 STEM classes and 2 humanities classes. And I think I should talk about them separately because by nature, they're very different classes and they get affected very differently by remote learning. So STEM classes, I was taking 2 big lectures. Uh, Not much changed, to be honest. It's really easy to record a STEM lecture because it's not based on discussion. It's a professor going up there and speaking for 75 minutes with a few minor questions. And I think it was much better because these classes were 9 a.m. classes and I would have to wake up and listen to them and would not understand the thing, just take notes and then would have to decipher what my notes say and would try to understand. But now I had recorded lectures, which meant that I could go back and listen to them again and maybe like stop, take some notes, go back whenever I don't understand something, etc. So I think they were a little better for me, actually. The only problem was that I had to take a take-home final exam for one of these stats classes. And the problem with that is you have the same amount of time, but you don't have the kind of the same motivation, same dedication to the exam, because when you're in the same, in the classroom, say with like 100 other people who are working on the exam, you're just like, oh, I have only 3 hours. I worked for the entire semester for this class, so I should do my best. But when you're at home, you're like, maybe I should get some tea. That will help me. Maybe I should like go wash my face and stuff like that. So I kind of found it really hard to focus on the exam. And it was a timed exam. So I think I would have done better. I mean, it doesn't really matter because it's pass fail, but I think I would have studied better and done better in the exam had I been on campus. But other than that, the STEM classes, they worked quite well for me, if not better than on-campus situation. I know this is a radical thing to say, but that was my experience. Humanities, I was actually really worried about them because they're discussion-based classes, and you need to be in the same room with the other people to be able to hold a very, I don't know, fruitful discussion. So I was very skeptical, but they also turned out to be fine because Zoom is, I mean, very convenient and very hospitable to discussion kind of sections. So one of my classes, it was a seminar, departmental seminar for history. And the only adjustment we had to make was that for the final paper, we were supposed to go to the library, pick up some books, and write a final paper based on those books. Since we were not able to go to the library, we were assigned books by the professor. So that kind of research and self-selecting component was taken out. But other than that, we've all, I think, managed to write a final paper. And the other class, it was kind of a laminar. So we would have maybe 15 minutes of lecture and then 25 minutes of discussion. It was meeting twice a week. The way the professor kind of adjusted that was we started meeting once a week for an extended period of time. And instead of lecturing, he started posting every week, like a lengthy post explaining the historical background of the of that kind of time period and giving like the background information that would supplement the readings that we were doing. and for maybe 75 to 80 minutes, we would only discuss. So the Leminar kind of turned into a seminar. And I think it also worked well, mostly because I was able to focus on my readings more, and the reading burden was simplified. So if we were to read maybe 100 pages on campus, we would now read maybe 60, 70 pages. So I could focus on those 60, 70 pages more. And again, the written post, I think, was much more helpful than the lecture that the professor used to give, because when you have a post in your hands, you can just read it, reread it. If you don't understand something, or if you want to inquire more about something, you can email the professor or just search about it. So overall, I think academically, I had zero to none problem. I mean, not very many problems.
So I didn't have any time zone issues given that I stayed here. And I think for the first week or two, sort of, I looked at academics as a sort of a welcome distraction, if anything, that it allowed me to take my mind off the crazy things happening outside. But also at one point, one of the people staying with me fell sick. And at least the symptoms match those of COVID. We maybe can never tell because we weren't able to get a test. But that really suddenly changed things. We had to, we share a bathroom, so we had to sanitize that regularly. We had to lock him in his room. There were times when his fever went really high, when he was like falling off his bed. And so suddenly I began to look at academics very differently. And there were times when, in those circumstances, like suddenly focusing on, on very niche histories, um, seemed somewhat a redundant thing to do. But I think he's better now, and no one else fell sick, and I think writing my papers in the end was also again alternating between it being um, a frustrating thing to do in the circumstances, something I lacked motivation for, but also at times, a bit of an escape. And I think the idea of of online learning being very different for STEM and humanities, or for seminars and lectures, seems to be true. Although all my courses were seminars, I think the largest class size I had was maybe 12 people, and so a lot of my classes really depended on in-person interaction. That although Zoom did a decent job of coming close to it, didn't really fulfill. Um, yeah. So I guess I have mixed feelings about academics.
I think the predominant issue that I faced was definitely time zones. In terms of the fact that I sort of had this one seminar class, which met from like in US time, it met from 3:30 to around 5:20, and that translated to around 12:30 a.m. to 2:30 a.m. But our professor has this habit of always taking this class on till like 3 a.m. So it sort of became a 12:30 to 3 a.m. situation. And then one of the most enticing things about that class was that I was the only person that was left to take over the class. So sort of the way that we were managing the class was that everyone was responsible for leading two of the class discussions. And the only two that I had were both ones that I led in Pakistan. So sort of leading discussions on critical theory at like 12:30 a.m. in the night wasn't the best, honestly. And I'm not sure if I did as good of a job as I would have done in the morning. And that sort of this change in schedule was imperative, especially because there were a couple of things that I just had to naturally miss out on. So for example, sections for my STEM classes that met at 7 p.m. were now meeting at 5 a.m. Like 4 a.m. or like around 5 a.m. And those were just classes that I couldn't possibly take. They tried doing alternate options, but none of them really worked for every single person that was sort of like people that were all across the world couldn't really tune into them. The good thing was that a lot of professors sort of made like participation and things like that optional, but that definitely like lowered my rigor, or like in terms of like my participation in those classes. If I'm not going to office hours, I was like, fine, I'm just gonna read the lectures on my own time. I don't have to bother with a particular deadline that I would have otherwise had. Besides that, I think there were just a couple of things that didn't translate well in terms of online learning. So like one of the things that translated very, very poorly was my lab. I worked as a research assistant in a cognitive science lab, where we sort of like our major job was to sort of research, call in families, and sort of work with children in terms of like having in-person participation. And that just couldn't possibly translate to 5 research assistants all over the world sort of calling in people, or even possibly doing the same thing online. So that lab sort of became moot towards the center of like the semester, and just became like a non-existent thing. Another thing that didn't translate super well was my Arabic classes. Like just the participation in that class, everyone would turn their cameras off, and like the professor would be like, does someone have the answer to this question? And no one was really bothered to turn their cameras on and really participate engagingly. So I think just in terms of the general rigor that people had for participating in classes, and the option to sort of opt out of certain elements of those classes really made everyone much more relaxed than we would have been otherwise. And I think that the major qualm that I had was that a lot of my classes became recorded classes. And what that meant was that a lot of these classes, which were in-person 55-minute lectures, translated into hour 15-minute long videos, because the professors just love lecturing. So just like the increased class time was sort of weird and annoying, but it was definitely helpful. So like got through it. Pretty much towards the end, I was pretty settled down with everything. But in the start, I think the time zone thing was definitely the biggest issue that I faced.
And following up on the general idea of accommodations, what do you feel, or do you wish that any of these accommodations that different professors or different departments did, would you like to see some of these accommodations made permanent in in-person classes or in-person settings?
I think definitely the flexibility in terms of being sensitive to people's personal circumstances, I think, is something that was a silver lining in this situation that I think we can all learn from. I have seen professors being more understanding than ever, and more not just understanding, but sensitive to what people might be going through, or both emotionally and in terms of like where they are located geographically. I think just allowing that space and that platform for students to speak up, and recognizing that students are not equally vocal, and people's circumstances obviously vary, but some are more vocal than others about it. I think just being given that space, or that option to kind of respond instead of having to actively bring it up or raise it up with the professors, was really helpful for me. Because if this option was being given to everyone, I was not put in a situation where I had to come forward and really try to explain my situation. So like that was helpful for me, and I think that that is something that even as peers, I think we can be a bit more sensitive about, like, you know, just recognizing that everyone's at different places, and sometimes offering up that platform for people to like respond to an option, rather than saying, so what works best for you, you know, giving them like option 1, 2, and 3 sometimes is really helpful. Yeah, that was in my experience, and I think this was only applicable to the class I took in the divinity school, which was this professor gave 3 different options. So option 1, like depending on what your circumstances are, you can opt for option 1, which is the most rigorous, and then all the way to option 3, and you wouldn't have to really explain why. Like there was no obligation to explain. Obviously, it would be nice to have an explanation, but should you not want to talk about it, should you not want to like disclose any personal circumstances, there was no burden or obligation to do so, which I thought was fair given the circumstances. So obviously, that I think would would translate well even in a situation where we aren't thrown into a global pandemic. Like we can do that even under normal circumstances.
Yeah, absolutely echoing every sentiment that Sneha vocalized. I think that's a very good point. More technically, I think some of the large lecture classes can be recorded. Um, that would relieve people from going to 9 a.m. lectures. And like, I don't know if this is only me, but whenever I go to a STEM class at 9 a.m., I just take notes and don't understand anything, and I have to just fill in the gaps when like I have free time and I can read over my notes. So it was just like when I had the recorded lectures, I was just like, why don't we do this all the time? Because this is just much more time, like time wise, it's much more efficient. So technically, I think that point, if we could have that, I think it would um, benefit students greatly in the positive way. But also what Sneha said, I think is very, very powerful, and we should take that into consideration.
Yeah, I would definitely echo what's been said before me. I think I went into the second half of the semester thinking that I would still want to take as much of it as I could. That it was a good test of self motivation. That um, there was still having an education at this point was a luxury that I wanted to take advantage of. But then I guess I also realized just how circumstances can really change dramatically. And suddenly education does not become the priority. And in those cases, having the support of my professors was really valuable. Um, and I think that sort of sentiment is important, next semester for all semesters, and whether we're online or in person.
Yeah, I agree with everything everyone said. And I think that one thing that I noticed during this particular time that was really, really helpful was that a lot of the services that are available at Yale were just being made more prominent or more obvious for people to be able to access them. And I think like there are a lot of features that are available. So for example, a lot of these classes have like note takers and notes available online that people take during that particular class. But these are just things that are sort of hidden or rather assumed that people would know about. And I think just the more like publicized narrative around these things and accessibility and making sure that everybody knew what kind of options were available to them, even if they are available at other times as well. I think just the publicity of this information was very, very important. And I think the second thing that I really appreciated was obviously like being more considerate of the fact that a lot of people have incredibly different circumstances that they come from and incredibly nuanced situations that they're in, be that at home, be that with their family or personally or anything of that sort. And I think even though a lot of what we talked about during the entirety of the universal pass-fail movement and all of that was that like Yale and being at Yale is this like equalizer that sort of puts every single person at the same foothold. I do think that there is an argument still to be made for how those circumstances that are present at home translate to your life on campus. And I think just being more cognizant of that, irrespective of whether or not we're on campus, is something that we can definitely do in the future as well.
I definitely feel all of the comments that you have made, and they're very passionate and outspoken. Moving a little bit forward, with classes already finished, I'm assuming for everyone, all major projects submitted and everything, and I know some grades have started to be posted as well. How does your daily life look like now? Is there a particular routine that you have for yourself, or is it more just free for all, more spontaneous now?
I think I don't have a clear-cut answer to that because it has varied so drastically. I went from having a more like clear routine than I've ever had in my entire life to kind of like I used routine as kind of like a crutch to normalcy, I guess. And I went from that to kind of like swinging in the complete opposite direction, which is like not even having a semblance of a routine. Like sometimes I sleep at 3 a.m., sometimes I sleep at 10 p.m., sometimes I sleep at 1 a.m., you know, like that I think for me has just kind of like, I don't really like have that anymore in my life, at this point at least. But I think that's like the biggest change and the biggest thing about my day, that it's a lot more spontaneous and it's a lot more dependent on things that are happening around me, which initially I thought was a bad thing that I needed to fix. And then I thought a bit more about it, and then I was like just thinking about how we like do this thing where we isolate ourselves in within a routine, we confine ourselves within this routine, and then when that routine's kind of like thrown out of order, we find another routine to kind of like confine ourselves within. And like obviously routine can be really helpful for people, and people plan, people you know, do all these things in advance, prepare in advance to feel that sense of control. But I think sometimes, like especially now, like we are being forced to take things as it comes, and I think that's like one of the biggest things I've learned from kind of just like letting my day run as it goes, and following like what I like want to do, or following what I feel like doing in this particular time, which is an incredible privilege, honestly, to have at this time, given the circumstances. But I would say I'm like fortunate enough to have that privilege, and I would encourage anyone who does have that privilege to like think of it in a different way, instead of seeing like, oh, my life has gone out of order, because that's how it felt for the longest time. Yeah.
Um, yeah, I think I still have a routine, albeit a more chaotic one. It's the month of Ramadan here, so I sleep like 4 a.m., wake up 1 p.m. in the afternoon, and wait until the breaking of the fast, while maybe spending like 3-4 hours on YouTube, some hours on Netflix, etc., etc., reading some Turkish novels, etc. Um, but I think one thing that was really interesting for me during this time was, um, like everything is always structured. You come, I mean, at least I come back here for winter break. I know in 3 weeks' time I have to go back to New Haven. I know that in May, early May, I'll take my final exams and be done, and we'll come back again, and then we'll maybe leave again for an internship, etc. So I was always maybe counting days until the next big thing that's happening in my life, the next move, the next kind of project, etc. Whereas now it's just, I'm like Sneha said, I'm taking the privilege of not having anything scheduled in my foreseeable future, and I'm just like taking things as they come, watching documentaries, I don't know, just enjoying myself, enjoying the time I spent with my family, this extra very precious time, because I mean after graduation we'll all have to start working. So it's just, I'm sad that I'm not with my friends on campus, but all at the same time I'm also appreciating the kind of this precious moment that the opportunity, I mean, I don't want to use this economics term, I hate it, but it's really the opportunity cost of staying at home is so low that you start not worrying about the fact that you're staying at home idly, but you're starting to enjoy the fact that you're staying at home idly with your family and friends and etc. So yeah.
Yeah, I've started my summer internship, which has given me some good structure and a routine, but also, I guess, the right amount of structure, in that my internship itself, by its nature, sort of doesn't have a fixed sort of working hours. It really varies with a bunch of different circumstances. Um, and so I still have time to sort of to do very spontaneous things. And I think I'm also, although I'd like to be home, I'm very grateful of ways in which New Haven is sort of is such a nice place to actually, I guess, be in quarantine, and that you have access to, shops and in general certain urban amenities, but it's also really close by to a bunch of parks and lakes and all sorts of stuff that perhaps we never fully discover while typical Yale students. That any afternoon, if I feel I have 3 hours free and just want to spend some time with myself, or with go spend time with my friends who are living with me here, you can just step out a few kilometers and you're suddenly in the middle of a park, and no one else is there, and you can enjoy the sun, which I think I'm also just realizing how much of Yale we spend not in the summer, and how different just the vibe and the aesthetic is in over here with in the summer. It's just a lot sunnier and brighter.
Um, for me, when I think I first moved back to Pakistan, I sort of tried recreating the kind of schedule that I had at Yale, which was sort of, for me personally, I had a terrible schedule on campus. So I was like, my day was sort of like from like 6 a.m. to the next morning at like 2 a.m. or 3 a.m. And I tried to, for some reason, tried recreating that just for the purpose of like still having some sort of normalcy or whatever that, like whatever I was aiming for at home. And what that sort of looked like was that I would still take my classes to like 4 a.m. and then wake up at 7 a.m. And then like go through the rest of my day. And that combined with just like reading tons of COVID news, really truly like burnt me out in under 2 to 3 weeks. Like 2-3 weeks into it, I was like, what am I doing? Why am I doing this? And that sort of re-questioning really like helped me reset my clock. And then especially after the semester ended, like Mehmet mentioned, it's also Ramadan here, and I really truly have been using that opportunity to catch up on the semester's sleep. So I also like sleep at 5 a.m. and then wake up at like 2 p.m., which is terrible but also incredible. And yeah, I think like just having the privilege to stay at home and to be able to do that, to be able to wake up at 2 p.m. and not have to do any essential labor or anything that needs for me to like exit the home. I think initially the thought of not leaving the walls of my home was incredibly restrictive, because I personally, even when I used to live in Pakistan, never really spent a lot of time with my family. Like during high school, I would come back home at 11 from debate camp and like a lot of other things. So just like staying at home within the four walls of my home was just never something that I had done before. So initially it felt incredibly restrictive. But I think just understanding and realizing that the kind of privilege that I have to be able to stay within these four walls and feel safe and protected and be able to kind of do that self-quarantine that a lot of people don't have the ability to do was just something that I have realized now. So it's been good since then. But yeah, the transition was a lot.
Definitely. And Ram started talking about summer internships. And I know for many, this is more of a nationwide thing in the US, that many locations have started laying off people, furloughing people, and even closing their internship programs, whether they were paid or unpaid. So have your summer plans changed? If you were planning to study abroad or do an internship or volunteer, has that changed? And have you been able to find another opportunity, or you're just taking the time to spend it with your family?
So before I came back to Singapore, I had no idea how my summer was going to look like. I was still in search of internships and hoping that I might be able to extend my wishful thinking, extend my time in the US before coming back to Singapore and spend summer there doing an internship. But little did I know that the world was gonna become like come to this situation, I guess. It was strange that when I came back to Singapore and I decided, when I found out that I was going to spend my summer here, I started searching for internships here and applying for internships here. And surprisingly, I got more certainty in my summer plans when I came back, when things still weren't that bad. So a lot of internships were actually still offering spots, but for like a remote position, like you would work remotely. Currently, I think the uncertainty is more on my part, that I'm not sure if that is something I still want to do. Because after having a taste of not defining myself as just a student, I think I've been thrown into almost like an existential crisis about like, this is how I've defined myself every summer. Like I'm always doing something, and what would it feel like to just not do something this summer and kind of take time to myself, or do something part-time and have a bit more time to myself. So I'm just still thinking about that, and the global uncertainty helps in the sense that I have more time to think about that, because there's kind of like a lot of internships have kind of extended their deadlines in us getting back to them, and they're being a lot more understanding about personal circumstances and uncertainty. So I think I will have till after the lockdown ends in Singapore, which is June 1st. Yes, June 1st, which is not too long. It's not like too far away actually. So I have till then to kind of decide what I want my summer to look like. But I think at this point, I'm just taking it as it comes and seeing what works best for me at this point. We'll see how it goes, I guess.
I had an unpaid research internship in London planned, and I was planning on funding that with the International Summer Award, which got cancelled. So, I mean, also people in London, the people I was going to work with, they're like, we can do this remotely. We don't want you to come over here, stay indoors for 14 days and stay like 6 weeks time here and then go back and stay indoors for 14 other days. So that got remote. And I think the kind of the workload is gonna be much lighter. And of course, the things I'm gonna get out of it is not gonna be the same. It's gonna be much inferior to what it would have been. I was initially planning on only doing that and not doing anything else. I was like Sneha in that perspective. I was like, I need some time to think about my future. It's already halfway through Yale, so let me just take some time, read some books, do whatever it is that I want to do. But then I've started searching some online classes that Yale offers during the summer session, and some classes that I would not be able to take due to distributional requirements maybe, or major requirements. But I really wanted to take were offered. One from Women and Gender Studies Department and the other from Classics Department about ancient civilizations in Asia Minor. So I said, yeah, let me take those classes, especially because the DSA is funding Yale summer session as well. Yeah, so those are the two things I'm going to be doing.
Yeah, as I mentioned, I'm doing my internship. It's sort of, I was going to go and work with a news channel in India. I'm doing sort of remote research for them now. It's of course not the same as what I hoped it would be, but it's been a great experience. It's allowed me to wake up with feeling with some purpose and feel that there is something I have to do today. That at least for me seems very important. I'm also trying to learn some languages to, keep my Arabic up, and maybe also learn Tamil later in the summer. Yeah.
So I was going to go to Morocco to study Arabic, but that got canceled, so not doing that anymore. And then I was supposed to sort of come back to Pakistan from Morocco, and then work with this publishing house in Lahore. But they're also obviously not running because of like the lockdown. And then I was supposed to come back to campus and was the director for this program through YERA for high school students at Yale, which obviously is also not happening anymore. But we sort of made the program remote, so we've been working on it remotely. A lot of the other options weren't available remotely, but they sort of switched all the study abroad programs into online classes, which sort of actually helped put that in perspective as to whether or not I even wanted to continue learning Arabic till like L4 or L5, and I ended up like picking computer science over picking my Arabic class, so it sort of analyzed what I wanted to do. But I'm taking classes through Yale summer session. I do have an internship in Pakistan, but I'm not entirely sure if I want to work at that internship because it's not offered remotely, it's offered in person, and the lockdown here has been lifted. But I've really been thinking about the notion of like essential workers and how a lot of people like who need to not be in quarantine are people that are essential to the economy, and I doubt that that's what my internship could possibly be. So I'm definitely not pursuing that, but I am doing the Yale summer session program. and taking this time to do a lot of individual projects that I used to do in high school, and I for some reason stopped as I transitioned into university. So just hoping to like reconvene those.
I'm glad that for most of you, most of your plans, one way or another, you've been able to find an alternative or to find the positivity out of this whole situation. For my last question, really, this week the university announced that we will be starting the fall semester in at the end of August as scheduled, but that some of the breaks might be modified in case students are allowed to come to campus, that they stay on campus during breaks. Do you have any particular worries if the university decides to do it online or in person or a combination of both?
So unfortunately, my time at Yale has ended and I will not be returning. And so that doesn't have direct relevance to me. But the thing is, it's interesting to see how like organizations are deciding to open up their campuses, but with like these precautions in mind and what that means for so many people. And I think it's become almost like such a taboo topic that because of people's different circumstances, it's almost as if what this decision could mean to somebody like could mean something completely different to somebody else. So like I'm just thinking along those lines, but for my local university there hasn't been much news given out yet, unlike Yale. But yeah, I'm interested to hear everyone else's opinions because it affects you guys a lot more directly.
Yeah, so Ram's suite mate kind of had the virus or possibly had some virus. And that was a very frightening story for me because he had to stay indoors. He couldn't go to the hospital, even though we're all insured through Yale. And I kind of feel very like frightened that if I go back and contract the virus, I'll have to maybe either spend like an extended period of time at a US hospital, or will have to stay indoors, or like some other thing will happen. I 100% feel more secure here back home, where I have a medical insurance, where I know that the coronavirus treatment is free, funded by the government, etc. So unless like there's a vaccine or there's some sort of a very, very effective drug, like 99%, 98%, I wouldn't want to go back in the fall. I wouldn't want to be flying internationally, let alone nationally. So I wouldn't want to go back, and I would feel very frightened if the physical classes were to resume. Um, Whereas I think online classes, even though they're not the same, I think it's a better option to consider at this point. I'm not talking about maybe spring semester, but for fall semester, it certainly is a reassuring option for me. Yeah.
Yeah, for me, of course, it's tough to think through all this uncertainty, but I do hope to go home sometime, hopefully before the semester starts. I feel like India is where I want to be right now, and that means that I'm not really too keen on taking online classes, and that if we do have online classes, I might, and I have been able to go back, I might consider taking a semester off. But of course, I think even me being able to go back is completely is really not something I can be sure of. And even going back, I was sort of thinking that I want to go back both for work and for family, but I've realized it might be that I have to go back for work or for family. That I guess doing the sort of on the ground work that I want to do in India will preclude me sort of living at home and spending time with my family, because I can't sort of take the virus wherever and anywhere. So yeah, I'm really not sure where things are, but I'm not too keen about taking online classes.
I think personally, like if the situation gets better, I would personally prefer in-person classes, just if I am like Ram mentioned, I'm also considering potentially taking a semester off or something like that in the event that classes are still online, just because a lot of STEM classes that I was hoping to take this fall just don't translate as well in terms of online learning, and I just don't think it's worthwhile for me to take those classes online. And I think one thing that also like online classes is sort of put into perspective is my ability, like the number of classes I end up taking. I think like taking 5.5 credits online was definitely like much worse than when I was taking them in person, and I think those sort of decisions will definitely be impacted. And as someone that's going into sophomore year, and a lot of people end up deciding their majors during sophomore fall, and a lot of applications to specific majors are also during sophomore fall. So like that's one thing that I have been concerned about, not being able to talk to DUSs in person, not being able to like take those prerequisites and stuff like that. But I also agree with what Mehmet mentioned in terms of if the situation is as bad as it is right now and we sort of travel internationally, do we have the kind of like assured guarantee of having the kind of healthcare available that is required in such a situation? But honestly, I don't know if that's available in Pakistan either. Like the only good thing about me being at home is that I'm staying indoors, because like nationally in terms of like having that kind of healthcare access, that's just not available. In terms of like public healthcare, like the provision is incredibly low, and then private healthcare is incredibly expensive. So I think a lot of people here, for example, also just generally opt out of like seeking healthcare. So I think like staying at home would just mean staying indoors for another like prolonged amount of time. So I don't think either option is ideal, but in the event that the situation does get incredibly better, I would personally prefer being on campus.
No, I definitely agree in the sentiment that neither solution is really, neither possibility is really ideal, and that there's going to be drawbacks, that some people might prefer one option and the others might have the opposite reaction to that. But that concludes today's talk. I appreciate you all participating, Sneha, Mehmet, Ram, Iman, and I really hope that you are all continuing doing well.